Okay, so let's have a look at our limit constraints. There are 4 of them. There are limit distance, limit location, rotation, and scale. The first one I'll look at is the limit distance. And this is the only one out of these 4 that actually requires a target. The other constraints are just constraining it to itself. So I'll show you this one first. But I've just added our limit distance there using our familiar shortcuts, and it has populated all our information over here. Some of this stuff looks very familiar. The head and the tail, that's going to limit it from the head of our target or the tail. So all the way to the left or 0 is the head, all the way to the right is the tail. We have our Bezier option as well if you wanted to follow the bendy bone. Now this distance here is the distance away from the target it can be. You can set this manually by typing in here. But when we added this constraint, it automatically set it up to use the current distance, which was 1 meter. If we want to reset it, you can actually just click that button and it will reset it to its current position there. Just to show you that, I'll move it and then go click, and you'll see that that has changed. Let me just reset that though. And then in our clamp region, we can decide how we want it to behave. Do we want it to stay inside that distance, outside that distance, or exactly on the surface of that distance? You can imagine a 1 meter sphere that is around our target. When we choose inside, the owner's going to stay there, but if the target gets more than 1 meter away, it's going to follow along like that. If we choose outside, it's going to have the opposite effect. So our target won't be able to get close. It's going to stay 1 meter away. And if we choose on surface, it's going to stay exactly 1 meter away at all times. Whoa, 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 dodge. And if you happen to want to animate our owner bone here, I would always suggest that you enable this effect transform. It's much nicer for the animators, but I'll show you this one when we get to our next constraint.
Now for all of the other limit constraints, we actually don't need the target because we're just limiting it to itself. So I'm just going to add the next one, which is our limit location. Then over here, you can see we have some options to turn on a minimum and a maximum for each of our axes. So let me just click that on. And it's jumped to world space there because we are in world space. So let's just change it over to local. So now I've technically limited it to not be able to move on any of its axes. However, it's not a good idea to use a constraint to limit it like this. If you wanted to limit all of the axes or just some of them, you're better off to lock those channels. That way the animator is not going to be scratching their head when they're trying to move it and it's not working. They can see, there's a lock there. They shouldn't put any animation data on these channels that are unused. So if you wanted to limit it totally, just use the locks up here. However, if you wanted to limit it within a range, then this is your best bet. I'll just add a minimum and a maximum of negative and positive 1. And now you'll notice when I move this around in the viewport, it's going to stop at those values. Now you notice that even though we set our minimum and a maximum to 1, when I drag it in the viewport, it can actually go past this value. And this is really annoying for the animators to try and figure out what that value is, unless you use this option down here called Effect Transform. When we enable this and then try and move it in the viewport, you'll notice that it stops at that value. This is much nicer for the animators to deal with because they don't actually have to try and figure out what that setting actually is. However, you only need to worry about this if it's a control that the animator is going to be using. If they're not going to touch it, you can just leave this off. But if they are going to be animating it, it's always nicer to use this Effect Transform button. And with all the rest of it, you already know how that all works. So on to the next one. Next is our limit rotation. This is going to be very similar to our last one. We can limit whatever axis that we want. And remember, when we enable it, it's going to use the space here. So let me just change it over to local space to make it a little bit more usable for this demonstration. And then we can set the minimum and the maximum. I'm going to limit the rotation between -45 and +45 on each one of the axes. And now when I rotate the bone, it's not going to go past those values that I set. Pretty simple. And much like our other constraints, if you wanted to limit some axes, it's best to lock those channels up here rather than using the constraint. And then our order here, we can decide the order in which it calculates this. Like I said earlier, this one is a setting that you can leave on default for now. There may be a situation in the very far future when you're doing something very technical that you might need to change this. But for now, you can just leave it on the default setting. And our last limit constraint is the limit scale. By now, you should know how this works. If we wanted to set a minimum scale, let's say we don't want it to go past 0.5 in any of the axes, and we want to limit it to, we don't want it to go above
say 2. I'm just going to select all of those and I'll enable that one there. So now when I scale it, you'll notice that it stops at a maximum of 2. And when I shrink it down, it's going to stop at a minimum of a 0.5. And again, if you wanted to limit the scale on some axes to not be able to scale at all, so we would set that to be 1, you're better off to actually lock the channels and not limit those axes. Awesome stuff.